Wanted to talk about terrorism a little bit more in detail with this chapter, since this is what happens when ideologies can get to the extreme. So let's back up a little bit and talk about how over the past few decades there's been a changing nature of war, which has been a result of more terrorist activity. Technology has gotten to the point where there's increased availability to get technology that enables you to kill people. That makes it a little bit more conducive for non-state groups. The strategy of war has been to use more guerrilla tactics, more counterinsurgency and anti-terror as a result. It's not the same as what war used to be traditionally with states, with front lines, with uniforms, with rules for prisoners of wars. Now most of the conflicts in the world are with non-state actors that have no rules to follow. There's no credibility for them to have to deal with. They can kill innocent civilians to get their points across. So that's what has also led to more terrorist activity. When you look at the wars that we've been in, there's been an 85% rise in civilian casualties since the 1980s because of the confusing nature of war, the amount that conflict has gotten into urban areas where there's no clear front lines, things like that. The wounded to dead ratio, just in the last few wars that we've been in, comparatively speaking, see Vietnam, the war in the 1960s and early 70s, the wounded dead ratio was 3-1. In the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the ratio was 16-1. So that gives you an idea that there's more of these rudimentary type devices that are being used as weapons, such as IEDs and the hidden bombs and things like that, that are causing more damage to bodies as far as the ratio goes. Even when you look at the Boston Marathon bombing, there was 3 deaths attributed to the Boston Marathon bombing, but about 300 actual injuries because of the shrapnel. And we also see that wars have become increasingly difficult to win. For example, when you go back as far as Korean War, ended in a stalemate. Vietnam War, nothing really accomplished there. Even looking at the Gulf War, we pushed Saddam Hussein back into his boundaries, but wasn't really won. And then that came back a decade later in the Iraq War, which lingered until we finally left. Afghanistan War, still lingering. Very difficult to win the types of conflicts that we are in today, and a lot of the conflicts, as we'll see, revolve around this guerrilla activity, terrorist activity. Backing up a little bit into chapter 10, when we talked about radical Islam and its resistance to liberal democracy, these ideas can have some potential formations into terrorist groups, as we'll see. The resistance here includes the attempts to put the individual in the place of God, as we discussed. The literal interpretation of the scripture in this case could justify that violence is permissible, eye for an eye, blood for blood, and terrorism would therefore provide a weapon for the weak and the oppressed, the downtrodden. Iran, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, due to the current political activity with the United States and Iran. Iran is an example of a theocracy. The parliament, body there, their legislature is elected, but they are first approved by the mullahs, so everything over their rule of law, as we talked about before with the Sharia law, everything is overseen by the religious doctrine. There's no freedom of press or academic freedom in these types of systems, theocracy, where reformists are met with violence from religious police. Iran is unique in that you have an increasingly young civil society looking for more freedom, so there could be some dilemmas there evolving. We've hit on some of the causes of current conflict before: ethno-nationalism, the desire for a state that matches the ethnic boundaries, the religious differences that we've touched on, the extremism, the fundamentalism. We'll get into that a little bit more here in a few minutes when we talk about the roots of terrorism. Since we did talk about radical Islamism in the last chapter, Islamic actors are the active participants in 10 of the Council on Foreign Relations of their 17 most critical, significant current conflicts in the world. Some other causes of war: ideological conflict, not quite as much as it used to, because revolutions tend to lose their ideological fervor, and they start to turn to pursuit of national interests, or in most cases nation-state interests that are divided along these cultural lines. And these revolutions rarely get exported to other states, so then they get mired into the states with sectarian civil war type conflicts. Starts to become more of a power struggle between these ethnic factions that could be aligned along religious lines. The Arab Spring uprisings, which started off in Tunisia and then diffused across northern Africa, they were driven by democracy. Tunisia actually won the Nobel Prize for their efforts to democratize their society, but it turned into a very unstable situation in Libya. We've already talked about Egypt, to where that resulted in a military coup. And then as we get on into the Middle East, Syria is still mired into a civil war. Yemen, also civil war. So that's what has happened in several cases with these Arab Spring uprisings. Here's the Council on Foreign Relations hotspot map, where you can see quite a bit of activity in the Middle East. But even when you look at some of the other activity around the world, such as in Nigeria, you've got an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, that is causing the conflict in that region there. A little bit more on sectarianism, particularly the Sunni versus Shia divide, which is at the heart of a lot of conflict in the Middle East. The Iraq War, where we went into Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein with mixed results, and that did open up or reopen the split between the Sunnis and the Shias in particular, as well as the Kurds in the northern section of the country, and we got involved in a sectarian civil war as a result of that, and that war turned out to be considerably more costly and destructive than what was originally planned, particularly after the original mission accomplished announcement was made. It got considerably worse from there. Other things to consider, though: the Shiite majority of Iraq, and that's part of what caused some of the upheaval, is because Saddam Hussein was sympathetic to the Sunni side of things, which was the minority of the country. So that's a sore spot when a minority is dominating the majority population, and then it flip-flopped, and then it became a messy civil war. And then when the Shiites got back control, they started to push out, despite the fact that they were trying to create a representative parliament type of situation, the majority Shiite then started to discriminate against the Sunni minority, which then had some extremist offshoots into Al-Qaeda. So still had to deal with the terrorist element. We also see that when we left Iraq, the Shiite majority was going to be more aligned with Iran, which is also predominantly Shiite. So after we had spent almost 8 years there fighting a war, and then kind of wanted to stick around to help stabilize the situation, Iraq did not want us there, and then as soon as we leave, they start to kind of move more towards Iran. So that's how complicated it can get out there. Also have to keep in mind is that there's other things to consider despite these religious alignments, Iraqis are Arab, Iranians are Persian. Sectarian divide tends to lean more towards the Sunni Shia alignments as opposed to some of these other cultural alignments. But the perception still exists in the Middle East that despite their internal divisions, the conflict is driven by West interest. Now, yes, some of that is true. Clearly, when you look at going way back to the imperialist interventions and involvements in the Middle East, but then even as recently as the Iraq War, which the United States' interest to get rid of Saddam Hussein was part of what stirred up a lot of what's going on here. So yes, some of that is true, but then when you look at this, examine this Sunni versus Shia divide, that is internal, and most of the conflict is generated from that internal division, not from West's interests. So we've got to be able to look at all sides here. We've already looked at this one right here with the breakup of Islam between the Sunni and the Shia groups there, as far as who is generally aligned and where they are typically as far as majority populations go with these particular groups here. Here's another chart that shows you how complicated it can get when you look at what some of the outside interests are looking in to these various groups. Looking at the United States, for example, the United States has been typically aligned with the miscellaneous rebel groups in Syria, primarily because they were pro-democracy. Now, of course, that got kind of messy when some of those groups had some terrorist-leaning activities in it. We also show that the United States has still aligned more with the Iraqi government, particularly when the Iraqi government was trying to get rid of the Islamic State, which is the terrorist organizations that we'll look at here in a minute, ISIS and ISIL. Also, kind of straddling the fence here, both sides of the fence, with supporting the Kurdistan regional government, which Iran also supports. So this is why it gets so complicated. When we look at Yemen, the United States is going to support the Yemen government, whereas Iran is going to support the Houthi rebels. And so we got a lot of crisscrossing and complicated relationships going on here. Russia, for the time being, seems to be fairly singular-minded in supporting the Syrian government. Iran has ties with Hezbollah, which is actually a terrorist group recognized by the United States as a terrorist group. It's very hard to keep all this straight, but this gives you an idea of how complicated it can be with all these different groups and the alignments from other outside interests. Talking about terrorism per se, we've already hit on the religious differences that contribute to extremism and fundamentalism. They are generally opposing secular ideas. We talked about Syed Qutb's philosophy that inspired Osama bin Laden, as well as a lot of the terrorist activity in the Middle East, opposing that modernization, resistance to modernization, resistance to this cultural amalgamation that is generally Western capitalist-driven, consumerism, materialism, sexualization of society, undermining of religious and traditional values. And this is more susceptible to the poor, vulnerable countries where there's less education, less opportunity. There's more disillusioned or unhappy or disaffected people that can get recruited by these ideas. Keep in mind, every religion in the world has fundamentalist or extremist elements. It's the political and socioeconomic conditions in that country that will either allow it to fester and form or to try to nip it before it does that. So that's what is the primary difference in countries where terrorist activity tends to form, that there may be some political instability or offshoots of the theocratic regime that are what's happening there. For example, Osama bin Laden, once he came back to Afghanistan, the Taliban was fairly sympathetic to his group. But this area right in here, particularly Waziristan, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, is pretty much what they call an ungoverned region of tribal areas. So that enables a terrorist group to go in there without much oversight and be able to recruit and train and form and build, because there's really no political stable control of the region there. And right over here in this area, Abbottabad, was where, after 9/11, Osama bin Laden eventually hid in that town, and the United States came into Pakistan to take out Osama bin Laden without any word or communication with Pakistan. So Pakistan had been our ally in the Afghanistan war, and then that kind of ruffled their feathers a little bit. It shows you how complicated it is from the U.S. point of view to take care of some of these interests, but yet also have to deal with other countries. Looking more at terrorism as far as its general definition, the political violence that targets civilians, condones the murdering of innocent civilians. No state can acknowledge that and still be a credible state. That's why terrorist groups are non-state actors with no rules, no credibility to maintain. They're just trying to make their point with their terrorist violent activities. Obviously, there are some states that have been aligned or perhaps even supported groups that eventually did kill civilians. That's where it gets complicated. But terrorism has become considerably more prolific over the last few decades because, as I've said, there's more availability of things that terrorist groups can do at lower cost with the digital technology, increased communication and access to this technology. So it's a lower cost. The cost versus benefits are a little bit more favorable for terrorist groups to form. They have a psychological goal to put fear and demoralize into the big nations. The randomness of their attacks is what makes them scary to big countries that have billions of dollars of military defense but can't find these very isolated terror cells very easily. And so the randomness of these attacks that do most of their damage in that regard, which creates an immense response from the big states such as the United States when you look at how much money and how many agencies that have been created just since 9/11 to deal with the war on terror. So that is part of this increased cost of response, the media attention. Now, there's considerable mixed success, and success should actually be in quotes there, because terrorism is a short-lived profession because, as I said, the credible states are not going to let a terrorist group succeed or sustain within their territories. I mean, Iraq is a good example of that, how they went all out in trying to get rid of ISIS and have weeded them out with the United States' help. But terrorist activity still could linger in Afghanistan. If the United States left, Taliban could take back over and perhaps be sympathetic with terrorist-type activity like they had been before. Terrorism tends to subside when the groups decide to become more politically legitimate, but of course that's a very long haul to do that, because if you're a terrorist group and then you just say, well, we want to now be a recognized political party, well, that's not going to happen overnight, because there's a lot of people that are going to be against that. For example, if that terrorist group had murdered their father, they're going to say, well, no, that ain't going to happen. So it might take generations for that to happen. But that does seem to be the best defense or best cure for terrorism, is to get those groups to reform into being politically legitimate groups, going through proper channels rather than this violence and targeting and killing of innocent civilians. That is a very difficult thing to do, as well as a very difficult thing for people to accept after they've done this. The State Department has a list of about 45 terrorist organizations, so let's take a look at that list. So this is the U.S. Department of State website of foreign terrorist organizations. Going back to 1997 is when they first started putting groups on the list here. Some of these names, that was a terrorist group that did the poison gas attack in Tokyo. Hamas is the recognized terrorist group that controls Gaza Strip, which is so much conflict between them and Israel. Hezbollah, I already talked about, operates primarily out of Lebanon with Iran ties. Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, also has been a problem with Turkey. Look, there's Palestinian Liberation Front there, a couple of Palestinian type offshoots. Here's an interesting example right here. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, whereas I talked earlier about how terrorist groups may eventually try to lay down their weapons and reform. Well, FARC did that, and they had been a land reform terrorist group for a couple of decades, and then just recently, last year or so, they tried to reform into a more, as I said, a politically legitimate group, and the government made a treaty with FARC, and the treaty was actually put out as a referendum for the public to vote on, and the public rejected it. So as you can see, it's a very difficult thing for a former terrorist group to turn around and say, okay, now recognize us as a legitimate political group. So that gives you an example of how difficult that is. Here's Al-Qaeda. When it originally formed, 1999 is when it was put on the list. Looking at several others here, there's another offshoot of Al-Qaeda. Here is the formation of ISIL, right here, put on the list, 2004. Al-Shabaab is another form of Al-Qaeda that particularly operates out of Somalia. There's another version of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Boko Haram, I'd mentioned them. They are an Al-Qaeda offshoot operating in Nigeria, and the word Boko Haram actually translates to Western education is forbidden. There's another form of ISIL there in 2014 put on the list, another version of ISIL, and there is the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant's branch. There's another ISIL in Libya, another version of Al-Qaeda. So you can see, since 9/11, when Al-Qaeda had less than 100 people and only a handful of people knew about the terrorist plot to crash into the World Trade Center other than the 19 terrorists. And then since that time, when we've conducted this war on terror, there is thousands more terrorists out there in the world. There's more versions of ISIS here. This one, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, is worth noting because of the political situation with Iran, particularly with the current administration that was somewhat anti-Iran, particularly when we're looking at the agreement for Iran to stop their nuclear production, and then the current administration tore up that agreement and then made the Islamic Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization from the State Department's point of view. So that might have some political overtones in it because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard has been around a long time, but the current administration felt the need to classify them as a terrorist group. Then there's a few groups here, you may recognize some of those, that have been delisted as terrorist groups over the years. Now let's look at some of the causes of terrorism. Unequal distribution of wealth and poverty can create groups of people that are unhappy, dissatisfied, could potentially get recruited into these these terrorist organizations that really want to go to the extreme. Talked about the history of the anti-Western sentiment that always seems to be in the background as far as terrorist groups recruiting, even though we've got this pretty big Sunni versus Shia divide, which creates the extremist sectarian elements there. There's also the common theme of the failures of the imperial conquests that we've talked about in that region, the clash between the fundamentalism and materialism, consumerism, modernization. The U.S. support of Israel has long been a sore spot for the radical Islamists in particular that have used that to potentially recruit more extremist thinkers. Education has got an interesting dichotomy here. Obviously, in countries where there is very little education, a lot of uneducated society, well, that lack of education provides opportunity to recruit people who are just not educated and may not know more about what other options are. But then on the other side of that, educated youths in these regions may have a bleak future. There might not be much opportunity for them. So they become disaffected, even though they may have some education. So we've seen that on both sides. Those could get recruited into terrorist groups as well. A study showed that British Muslims were driven to ISIS through some of the same things as to what causes people to join gangs, for example, boredom, disaffection, a sense of belonging, using the gang as a replacement somewhat to the family, and creating that bond, recruit them, and in some cases kind of program them to do the things that they need them to do. And how you can explain somebody's willing to strap a bomb to themselves and blow themselves up for this cause, that's something that's going to take quite a bit more explaining as to how that happens, but it does. And then as a result, a lot of the conflict in the world and a lot of the military expense, and particularly the war on terror, has changed how the United States defense system actually operates, particularly since 9/11, where we've put so much emphasis on fighting terrorism, seeking out terrorist groups, preventing them from forming. We're also using sanctions against states that are suspected of sponsoring terrorism. We are using economic development, trying to help these poor, vulnerable states, help them to develop in order that there's not as much, I guess you could say, incentive for terrorist groups to form. If your society is working, more educated, happier, less likelihood that they're going to be recruited by terrorist groups. Foreign aid could be targeted to decrease the possibility of terrorism, that foreign aid could be kind of dangled out there as a reward for a state to try to prevent its terrorist elements. And then there's the policing aspect of it, where the coordination of law enforcements within those countries with international agencies, kind of making it a regional or global effort to prevent terrorists from even forming. And as I've already talked about, the war on terror, particularly in the United States, Afghanistan, we're still there and looking at trying to remove ourselves from Afghanistan for the most part, but at the risk of Afghanistan falling back under control of somebody like the Taliban. In addition to the war efforts, particularly after we got out of Iraq and the Afghanistan war subsided for the most part, then we picked up our surveillance activity and our drones activity in order to try to combat the war on terror. I wanted to focus on terrorism just a tad more here because it's where ideologies can go to the extreme route to create quite a bit of death and destruction that requires quite a bit of response, which we've seen in the United States, particularly in the last 2 decades.